Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. What do you do when you're the organizer of a workshop and the speaker standing right at the front, won't stop talking? Back in 2004, our business was very young and we were hosting our first ever workshop in the US. We'd conducted a few workshops in New Zealand, but when it came to making this overseas trip, we felt a lot of pressure. And so we decided to have 2 additional speakers at our workshop. And day 1 started out, and then we had day 2. And day 3 of the course, one of the speakers was heading dangerously close to the time that he had been allocated. So you do what you always do, which is at the end of the room, you're signaling, okay, your time's up. So I started to move forward. I moved from the back of the room to the middle of the room. But he wasn't slowing down. With 3 minutes left, I was within 10 feet of him, but he didn't have any intention of wrapping up. Did he overstep the mark? Of course he did. The slides kept coming, and I did something that I'd never done before. I stepped up to him, put my hand on his shoulder, and said to the audience, "Steve's done a wonderful presentation. Please give him a warm round of applause." And it's that action that brought his presentation to an abrupt halt. However, such embarrassment could have been avoided if he had timed his presentation well. But how do you time your presentation so that you never overstep the mark? Over the years, I've learned a few tricks when making presentations. And an excellent presenter can avoid time overruns with design rather than time management. And that's because things go wrong on the day of the event. The sound system may throw a tantrum. The presenter before you might cause a lot of disruption. And sometimes even a well-meaning MC may spend too much time introducing you, which gobbles up a lot of your precious time. Time management doesn't help in this situation. Design does. And most of the design depends on how you treat the last segment of your presentation, which is really the part where you run out of time. So let's find out the 3 elements that you need to consider when designing a presentation. The first thing is why you need to design part 3 of your presentation first. The second is why part 2 should have the most examples. And the third is why you should avoid questions at the end. Let's start out with the first one, which is why you need to design part 3 of your presentation first. Imagine being woken up from a sound sleep and being able to give a presentation, a perfect presentation. To most people, such a scenario is unimaginable, and it was no different for me. Giving a presentation, even a short one, was very difficult when I was wide awake, let alone when I was tired and asleep and just woken up. And like most of us, presentations was reasonably terrifying. And then I ran into my friend Eugene Moreau, and he taught me how to break a presentation into 3 parts. And he was very fascinated with these 3 parts. In his teaching, he would talk about Huey and Dewey and Louie and Goldilocks and the 3 bears and 3 blind mice and the start, the middle, and the end. So 3 became this very crucial baseline on which we would have these presentations going. And he had me convinced, which is why 3 topics show up in all the presentations and even in this podcast. So everything is fine. We have 3 parts to the presentation. Everything's going really well. But I often found that was not enough. I would be running out of time, and it took a bit to figure out why this was the case. When Eugene said, break it up into 3, I did what you do with pizza, or with cake for that matter. I broke it up into 3 equal slices, and that was clearly a mistake. Instead of 3 equal slices, you need to split it up so that the most information is in part 1. There's a little less in part 2, and yes, you guessed right. Part 3 exists just as a little wedge, just this tiny little bit. The reason for such a breakup of information is because you're more likely to introduce the big concept at the start. Then you add a little bit more in the middle, and by the time you're reaching the third part, your audience is mentally scrambling. And they're scrambling to work out how to understand this information, how to apply it to their own business, what could go wrong. And this is why part 3 needs to be as tiny as possible. Let's take an example from the brain audit presentation. When I first started in the business, I'd go around and I'd give 30 to 45-minute presentations of the brain audit. The first part would introduce the main concepts of the brain audit. I'd talk about the 7 red bags, and then I'd list them out: problem, solution, target, profile. I'd go right through the whole list. And even though there were 7 red bags, I'd only cover 3 of them in the first part. So that is the problem, the solution, and the target profile. Which would take me to the second part of the presentation. And the second part didn't involve any new information. Instead, it took those 3 bags and it showed the audience how to use them. Take the problem, take the solution, take the target profile, put them together, and now they could create a trigger statement. The audience could create that trigger statement. So we've finished the first part, we've gone through the second part, created a trigger statement, and then it comes to the third part. The third part would explain why there needed to be a sequence, why you need to go and start off with the problem first and not the solution first. So why is this sequence in the brain audit? And how breaking that sequence would cause their client, the client who's buying from them, to hesitate, to walk away without making that purchase. And you can slightly see how this helps with keeping time, can't you? If each part is equally substantial and you lose track of time, or you get too deep in the examples, you get stuck. You're more likely to be in deep trouble if you've got a ton of slides to go. But let's say you've somehow managed to take up a lot of time in part 1, you can move quickly through part 2, and then part 3 becomes a bit of a formality. It closes the presentation because you don't want to leave those clients hanging. You want to get that closure in place. But keeping the third part super light is what will help you slide through to the end with loads of time to spare. However, things can and will go wrong under the best of conditions, which is why it's a good idea to make sure that everything goes fine in stage 2, long before the finale of your presentation. And the best way to make stage 2 super robust is to load it with examples. Examples? Why do you use examples? Let's find out. If we were to look at 3 parts of your presentation, they would roughly look like this. Part 1 would be the introduction of the concepts, part 2 would comprise of the examples, and part 3 would bring closure. Having examples in part 2 seems logical because you've introduced the concept in part 1, and the examples, they tend to help the audience understand that idea a lot better. However, loading the examples in part 2 is crucial from the point of keeping to time as well. It's not that you can't have examples in the first part of the presentation. However, it's more than likely that you've spent that first part introducing the concept. For instance, you may be introducing a concept like how to negotiate when the client is acting arrogant. If you've got that kind of topic, then you have to establish what arrogance means and how those arrogant situations can be minimized or reduced. So you're going to need that first part to just establish that and make sure that the audience knows exactly what you're talking about. Now you're moving to the second part and you're giving examples. The examples, as you can tell, allow the audience to understand that concept a lot better. And we know this. We've already covered this. So first part, concept, second part, examples. Let's say you have 3 examples and each one of them takes about 5 minutes to explain. This means that you're going to need at least 15 minutes to cover all 3. But those 15 minutes, they were under ideal conditions, under conditions where nothing was going wrong. And you've stepped on stage and the MC has taken up 5 more minutes and now you have just 10 minutes. And this is where you should have just 1 or 2 slides per example. Because if you have 7 or 8 slides per example, you're going to have to click through every one of them and it will look like you're rushing through them. So 7 and then another 7 and another 7, and it will look like you're rushing through them. But if you've got just 1 or 2 slides, you can go into as much detail as you need or cut back as much detail as you need. Which means you're still presenting all of those 3 examples, but you don't look like you're rushing through them because they just have 2 slides each, and you can cut back on as much detail as you need. And even if you don't use slides in your presentation, this is still an excellent system to have in place. This way you can put in as much detail as you want. Maybe the first example has a lot of detail, second one has a lot of detail, and the third one you can slide through. Or you slide through all 3. Whatever you choose to do based on the time you have. And so these example slides, they act as a timekeeper, your own internal timekeeper that no one knows about except for you. You've not hurried through anything. You've given your examples and you've finished your first part, which is your concept, second part, your examples, and now you're ready to go to the third part. And in this part, a lot of presenters say, okay, we'll take questions at the end, and you shouldn't. And this also takes us, coincidentally, to our third part, which is why you should avoid question and answers at the end. When I did my first presentation, my very first presentation of the brain audit, and probably the first ever in New Zealand, I took questions from the audience. And this hand goes up. And it's this real estate agent asking me a question. I was naive, of course, and I had no idea that Eric, the guy asking the question, was a bit of a minefield. Guess what happened next? Eric took over the show. He spoke endlessly describing his own business, and then, instead of asking the question related to what was being presented, he treated his time, or rather everyone's time, as if it were a one-to-one consulting session. Now, it's likely that Eric might not show up at your event or your webinar, but if he does, then you've got real trouble. This trouble is more prevalent at an actual event rather than a webinar because a real event tends to have more inflexible time slots. If I know that I have a fixed time slot, I make sure that I announce the following. I won't be taking any questions at the end of the presentation, but I will be in the hallway now and during the breaks where I will be more than happy to answer any of your questions. And with a statement like that, you've bought yourself more time. If you make the mistake of taking questions at the end, you have to factor in another 10 minutes at least. And that's if you don't have a disruptive person in the audience. Once you lose control of the session, it's hard to get it back. And it takes a very seasoned speaker to be able to get the question session back on track. On a webinar, it might be easier. It depends on who's hosting the webinar. And while I will take questions on webinars, I seldom do so at live events. I want to be selfish in a way that I get the best possible message to my audience. I want to spend every single minute that I'm on stage explaining, giving examples, even giving a little breathing space so that the audience can savor the information, can absorb the information instead of just rushing through it all. As a speaker, you want to respect the time that is given to you by the organizer. I have seen presenters that violate this time by as much as 20 minutes. And it's not fair to the organizer, it's not fair to the audience, and it's definitely not fair to the speakers that come after you. Even if you're the last speaker, it doesn't matter. You have been given a specific amount of time. You have to stick to it. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how important your message is. You have to work within the time you've been given. If you're going to get professional, act like one. You might be a celebrity tomorrow, but be aware of the fact that you are a professional first and a celebrity second. The best speakers know the rules, or at least set the rules with the organizers, and then they stick to them. Time overruns are not needed and can be avoided with a touch of planning and a bit of on-the-spot juggling. And you figured that out. It's not that hard. All you need is a little design. So let's find out what we've covered on this podcast. We covered 3 parts. The first is why you need to start with part 3 of your presentation. So this is about design. You go, part 3 is the smallest part 2, a little bigger, part 1, the biggest. Like Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. Biggest, medium, just right. No, not exactly, but bigger, smaller, and smallest. And that's how you go about designing that presentation. And that makes it very easy to go through it and finish without introducing new information in part 3. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that part 2 should have the most examples. So part 1 was all about creating this concept, getting that concept across, whatever your concept is all about. But now you've got to have examples. And those examples, they need to have a couple of slides if possible. Not 6 and 7 or 8 slides per example, because when it's up there, you'll have to slide through the slides. You'll have to skip through the slides very quickly, and it will look like you're rushing, and the audience will not appreciate it. So keep a couple of slides and explain those slides in great detail. And that way you can go 2 slides, 2 slides, 2 slides, and you're done. 6 slides, 3 examples, that's fine. And finally, you should avoid questions at the end. For one, you don't have that extra time, so that in itself is worth it because now you've got extra time. And the second thing is some bozo will stand up and ask a whole bunch of questions or take control, and you've lost all the momentum and all the impact that you've created in all of the time before that. So unless you really want to get yourself in trouble, avoid questions at the end, and that way you can keep to time. And that's what really marks you out as a professional. So what's the one thing you can do today? One of the things that you can do today is to create that structure, which is the concepts, that's part 1, and then the second are the examples, and then finally, whatever you want to cover in part 3. And that's just like a wrap-up, a summary, that kind of situation, especially if it's a small presentation or webinar. So that's what you can do today, and you'll find that your presentations always end on time. And now, as always, let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics Land. If you've been waiting for the headline course to open, for the seats to open, well, you have to wait a little longer because we've postponed that date, just the date of signing up, to the 13th of July. So that was somewhere at the end of June, but now it's on the 13th of July. So that's lucky for some, lucky for those who get in. That's the 13th of July. If you're in 5000 BC, you get preferential treatment. You get in a day earlier. So for the rest, of those, everyone who's on the waiting list, that's 13th of July. To sign up, go to psychotactics.com/HL. That's headlines. There's also the Da Vinci cartooning course. You know that something inside of you is talking to you and saying, hey, you can draw, and you've just not had the right teacher before. Allison is a great teacher, and you will find that out for yourself on the course at psychotactics.com/Da Vinci. That's DAVINCI. Now, both of these courses require you to be on the waiting list, or alternatively, if you're a member of 5000 BC, then you get a separate notification. But if you're not a member, then you have to be on the waiting list. So go to psychotactics.com/HL or /Da Vinci based on what you want to achieve. All the details, all the pricing, everything is on that page, so you'll find everything quite clear. And if you have any questions, just email us. As always, join us in 5000 BC because that's a really cool place to be. It's the membership site where you have to be kind and be helpful, and I answer all your questions. So it's a really cool place to be. So we'll see you in 5000 BC, and bye for now. Still listening? Making presentations and fitting them right to the last minute is probably a very crazy thing to do. But what I tend to do is I always ask for more time, and I probably mentioned this before, and therefore I'm more cautious about making sure that I finish on time. And yet, there are times when you have to be double prepared, which is what I learned when I was at another presentation, because I ran out of time, or at least it seemed like I was running out of time. And it was because someone in the organization decided to speed up all the speakers. So they decided if we say 10 minutes, then they will take 15 or 20 minutes. So let's put it 20 minutes in advance. So they were jumping the queue by at least 10 minutes, which is when I was shown 10 minutes left, I really had 20 minutes left. So yes, I was a little more rushed than I needed to be. And that taught me a lesson, because next time I'm going to have my own person sitting in the audience with a nice big iPad so I can see the time for myself. I know there are other gadgets. I know you could have gadgets in your pocket and timers in your pocket, but it's nice to see something where you're still looking out at the audience and you can see 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and then it's time to close up. And it's time for me to close up here, and we'll see you in 5000 BC land. Bye for now.